Before you watch the following video, I just wanted to apologise for the amount of time that it's taken me to post this video. And I just want to say a huge thank you to one of my friends who sent me the following video.
Better to post a lackluster or poorly shot video if you don't have the proper equipment, or is it better not to post at all?
Number one.
Number one. But what if it doesn't put you in the light that you feel that your company...
Then you're insecure and think that production value is the light you're in, not the words coming out of your fucking mouth.
I think sometimes you get so caught up in the production and almost the delivery method of what you're about to say or the video that you're about to post. And sometimes I think you forget that irrespective of the delivery method, irrespective of the production, that what you have to say still has value, no matter the method that you deliver it in. So yes, I know the production of this video isn't great and I probably should have rehearsed it a little bit more before I started recording it, but I didn't. And yes, that's something that I could re-record this video for the 4th time, but that would mean a further delay in me posting this video. Hi, welcome to my channel where we discuss anything and everything to do with psychology and mental health. In this video, it will be the first part in a 2-part series where we will be talking about everything and anything you need to know about becoming a cognitive behavioural therapist in the UK. So there are a couple of routes to becoming a cognitive behavioural therapist, and 2 of those are the longer route where you apply for a funded course, and the shorter route, which is applying for a self-funded course, which means that you would pay for the course yourself, whereas in the other one, maybe a charity or the NHS pay for your course. For the longer route, you would apply for a high-intensity trainee role, and why this is normally the longer route is that it's slightly more competitive and they normally ask you for experience and qualifications. So these courses, you're more likely to get onto them if you already have a core profession. And I'll put a list of core professions on the side. And basically it means that you've done an undergraduate degree that qualifies you into a profession. So you can also apply for these courses if you've done a psychology undergrad, but it might require you to have more experience and more qualifications after you've graduated. So you might have to do a PWP post, a CWP post, or qualifying in a lower intensity therapy and then working your way up. Whereas the shorter route is less competitive in that sense because you have to pay for the course that you're doing. And because you have to pay, that takes a little bit of the competition away. So here are 2 examples of potential pathways to getting onto the CBT course. So as you can tell, the pathway from a core profession is much shorter than someone who graduates from a psychology course. However, it's still possible to get onto the course. There might just be a few more things that this person might need to do to be able to get a place on that course. And again, this is based on my knowledge and experience and people that I've known to get onto the course. And I've added this just to give you an example of what paths can look like. It's not meant to be a cookie cutter path. And although applications don't say there needs to be a qualification in a low intensity therapy or experience specifically delivering interventions, this could be potentially useful, particularly when you're applying for this type of course. Because it's funded, it's competitive, and any qualifications or experiences could be that boost that you need in your application. I think it's important to know whether you do a funded course or a self-funded course, it's going to be a longer process if you're a psychology graduate. And although the self-funded route is less competitive, it still might be challenging to get onto those courses. So with a self-funded course, you still need a minimum of 2 years experience post-qualification. So after you've graduated, you need 2 years experience. So here are 2 examples of routes to a self-funded course. So as you can see, the route from a core profession qualification to a place on the CBT course or becoming a CBT therapist is much shorter than if you did a psychology degree, similar to the one before. But you can see that the route from the psychology degree to the CBT course is much shorter here on a self-funded course. And if you've done a psychology undergraduate degree, what you'll need to do is a KSA. KSA stands for Knowledge, Skills and Attitudes. And that's where the process, if you're a psychology grad, is longer whether you do the longer route or whether you do the shorter route. So what the KSA is a series of essays that justify and provide evidence for your knowledge, skills and attitudes. And what you're basically providing evidence for is that you've got the knowledge, skills and attitudes that is required to be a cognitive behavioural therapist. And you're at the same level as, let's say, a mental health professional is. And these are countersigned by mental health professionals that you've worked with before. So it might include previous managers, people that you've worked with that can testify to you having these knowledge, skills and experience. And some of these can be, because some of them are knowledge, it could be maybe your lecturer from your course or something like that. So hopefully that makes sense as maybe a small summary of what a KSA is, but I will do a series of going through each KSA criteria to help you through doing the KSA, because I know it can be quite overwhelming when you're first looking at it, and it can be quite long and tedious. So if your goal is to be a cognitive behavioural therapist and maybe you're thinking about doing an undergraduate and you haven't chosen one yet, I would actually consider doing an undergraduate in one of the ones that I've listed, because it will make the process a lot easier for you. And after graduating, you will be earning a lot more if you choose one of these professions rather than doing psychology. So the next is courses that count. So there's a lot of cognitive behavioural therapy courses that don't actually qualify you as a cognitive behavioural therapist. So there's courses that actually cost quite a lot of money for something that doesn't qualify you in anything. And they're more of informational courses, or if you want to use cognitive behavioural therapy tools and techniques in your practice rather than being a cognitive behavioural therapist, if that makes sense. So level 2 courses allow you to meet the minimum training standards. And what that means is that when you graduate, you'll meet all the standards required to be acknowledged and credited as a cognitive behavioural therapist. So what that means is that when you've qualified from a level 2 cognitive behavioural therapy training course, is that you've qualified as a cognitive behavioural therapist and you can start practicing as one. And it also means that when you apply for accreditation, is that you've met the minimum training criteria required for you to be accredited. So it'll make your accreditation more successful than if, let's say, you haven't done a course that is accredited, then you would have to do extra modules or extra learning to be able to get your course to be accredited. And providing that evidence can take a little bit longer. Also, I get the question a lot of, okay, what's the difference between a postgraduate diploma in cognitive behavioural therapy and a master's in cognitive behavioural therapy? And essentially, in terms of qualifying, there is no real difference. If you've done an accredited course, both will accredit you and qualify you. The only difference is that one's a master's, one's a postgraduate diploma. So if, let's say, you want to go and do a doctorate, most doctorates ask for at least in the last 2 years to have done research experience. So you're doing a master's can potentially be useful for that, but you have to also consider, if you're doing a self-funded course, the master's does cost more than doing a postgraduate diploma. However, if you are applying for a postgraduate loan, those only apply to masters, so you have to make sure that you're doing a master's course to be able to get that funding, if that makes sense. So if you are planning to get a loan, a postgraduate loan that's provided by the government within the UK, I don't know about other countries, so if you're applying for that course, then you need to be enrolled onto the masters, if that makes sense. Otherwise you can't they don't fund postgraduate diplomas. But either way, both will qualify you as a CBT therapist if you're doing a level 2 accredited course. I know some trusts within the NHS, they provide funded courses that are not accredited. So what that means is that normally you can work within that trust, for example, but it will be harder for you to actually move into other trusts, because mostly people ask you to at least be provisionally accredited to be able to do a course in CBT, if that makes sense. If anything doesn't make sense, again, leave it in the comments and I'll get back to you guys, or I'll address it in my next video if it's relevant for everyone. So the next few points will include my personal experience on courses, because obviously I haven't looked into every single cognitive behavioural therapy course out there. So I've only ever looked into 2 courses, which is at the University of Bolton and Buckinghamshire New University. So I can only give advice on those 2 that I've specifically looked into. But if you go onto the BABCP website, so just an easier route is just to go to Google, just type in BABCP level 2 courses, and a whole load of courses will come up which are level 2, so they meet the minimum training standards to qualify you as a CBT therapist. You'll see level 1, but ignore that part. What you're looking for and what this video is related to is the level 2 accredited courses. So click on those and you'll see all the universities that are accredited, and so all the courses that you can apply for basically are on there. So have a look through, see what's closer to you and see what courses you like. And yeah, so all of those will meet the minimum training standards, and that's what I did when I applied for courses. So the third topic is being on the course and what that's like. So being on the course, normally if you're doing a part-time course, you have to go to university once a week from lectures between 9 and 4, or sometimes you have supervision till 6, so you're going from 9 AM to 6 in the evening. But obviously this is going to vary depending on the university you choose. If you're doing the course full-time, it's 2 days a week, and then there's placement. So if you're doing the course full-time, just double whatever I'm telling you, because that's the only difference, is just halved for part-time. So in the minimum training standards, you have a total number of hours you should have achieved before you finish or before you complete your course. And part of that minimum training standards is the number of hours, clinical hours, you should have completed before you qualify. And how that calculates is that you need, for part-time courses, you need a minimum of 3 hours a week to be able to, by the end of your 2-year course, to have met that minimum training standard. And if you're full-time, that will be 6 hours. But although that's the idealistic view of it, so you might get people who don't attend, sessions that don't happen, clients that don't show up, or just not having the client base available at your placement. And what that would mean is that you would just have to do more hours a week. So you need to be flexible in that way, because you can't, if someone doesn't attend a session, you can't count that towards your hours. Even if it was like an intended session, unless you've actually done that session, you can't count it towards your hours. So for example, when I was on the course, my placements initially started on Mondays, and that meant that my hours were disrupted by bank holidays, people not attending, and just not having the appropriate clients for me to see as a trainee. So I had to be flexible, and over time I had to actually dedicate more time to placement. And I think that's something, because your training depends on it, that's just something you have to adjust for and make time for, even if you don't have time. So eventually I went from having placement 1 day a week in the evenings, which was 4 hours, and which included my supervision time as well, to having 2 days a week, and then eventually went up to 3 days a week. And then obviously when I started getting more hours, I just started tapering down, where my client caseload allowed me to do that. So the fourth topic that gets brought up quite a lot is how I self-funded. and I graduated from my undergraduate in 2016, and soon after I started working, I realised that I had to do a postgraduate something. I didn't know what I wanted to do in terms of postgraduate courses, but I knew I had to do something to actually develop a career in psychology. So I started saving small amounts, because I think as a band 2 and a band 3 you can't really save much, but I saved where I could, and I eventually ended up saving not enough for the whole course, but enough to actually, so I was saving over 2 years. When I got onto the course, I had some savings to be able to actually fund some of the course, and I worked throughout my postgraduate. Over the 2 years, I paid in installments, and I did monthly installments, so I really broke down it was around just under 10,000, I want to say. So I went to, I think it was the finance office at my university, and really broke down how much I needed to pay each month to be able to afford the course at the end of the course. So I really broke it down into how much do I need to pay this month, and focused on each monthly payment. And that made it easier than, okay, trying to pay in full, if that makes sense. So I just paid in monthly installments, and over the 2 years, so I also paid during the summer. So that really broke it down. So the 2 or 3 months we had during the summer, I was also paying then, but then I was also able to increase my hours at work. So that worked really well in terms of being able to afford the course and work and do placement at the same time, because it gave me that flexibility. So personally, I didn't get a postgraduate loan, but if you're doing a master's in cognitive behavioural therapy, you are able to get a postgraduate loan if you need one. And I think postgraduate loans only are available if it's your first master's. So that's why I would really consider, when you are thinking about a master's after graduating from psychology, because it's really important you don't almost use the funding that's available on another master's that doesn't qualify you in a profession. Even though I think all masters are great, and it might increase your chances if you've already done a postgraduate master's in getting onto a funded course, let's say, but that's not going to be available if this is your second master's, if that makes sense. So the postgraduate loan will give you a maximum of £10,000 and obviously it's a loan, so you do have to pay it back after you've qualified. And it does have interest and all of those things, so that's something that I would consider. But if it's your only option at the moment, sorry, that was my arm. So if it's your only option at the moment, I would take that as an option, because the pay difference between a graduate job as a psychology grad and a postgraduate job as a CBT therapist, the pay is just so drastically different that if I didn't have savings, that's the route I would have gone down. So my next topic, which is topic 5, I believe, is that how did you find a placement, and how do you find a placement, and do courses offer you placements? So some courses do offer you placements. So if you've gone for a funded course, almost like your service to them for the self-funded course is that you do a placement in one of their services. So you're being a trainee cognitive behavioural therapist within their service, and that's almost what you give them in return for your course, if that makes sense. So they give you training, you give them time, and they employ you, so that you still get paid for it. So they employ you as a cognitive behavioural therapist, and that's on funded courses. On self-funded courses, you have to mostly find your own placement. Sometimes courses have a few placements, maybe at the university or services that they're related to, and they can offer you or guide you in that direction. but you still have to apply for those placements as if it was a job. And any placement you get, most of them, you have to have a job application, you have to have an interview and go through that whole process to apply for a placement. And yes, you, on a self-funded course, getting confused now. So on a self-funded course, you have to find your own placement. And I found my own placement. My first placement did not work out. My first placement was in a private hospital that I used to work in, and what actually ended up happening is that when it was time to actually start the placement fell through, and yeah, I was just not getting responses back. I didn't know when to start, and eventually I just had to find another placement, which actually worked in my favour because I ended up finding a IAPT NHS placement, which I recommend looking at NHS placements first, because they're so used to trainees and they have such structure and protocols and general know how to handle trainees and what cases to give them and general processes in place. You'll find that your trainee experience is a lot more smoother than it might be in another service where maybe they're not used to trainees as much, if that makes sense. And a placement is something that you have to continue across your 2 years. So everything, the whole point of the placement through the 2 years is that you're practicing as you're taught. So you're taught a particular model or a particular disorder that you can work with, and you then try and put that onto your caseload and try and work with that. Sometimes you might actually be restricted by the service you're working with. So if, let's say, for example, you're working in a particular service with a particular disorder, then you might actually be limited to that disorder. So you have to try and find other things that you can work with. So for example, if you're working in an eating disorder unit, you might actually find that, okay, we're working more with self-esteem over here, we're working more with depression, more with anxiety, and try and find those cases where you're actually trying to experience a variety of different disorders, if that makes sense. And how I found my placement is I literally emailed hundreds of places, and I'm just going to admit that I just copied and pasted the same email and just tailored it a little bit to each service that I was working with. So I had almost like a template and then just adjusted it for each service I was asking for a placement for. Also, it's important to note that although you can look for any placement that you want with any disorders and anything broadly ranging as you want, it's important to know that you are only allowed a certain amount of group hours and a certain amount of child and adolescent hours. So unless you're on a specific high intensity CBT course for young people and children, the course will actually depend on you mostly practicing with adults. So 50 of your hours, so I think it's 200 hours, don't quote me, I will leave it somewhere on this side. Most of your hours will actually be made up of adult hours. So let's say it's 200 hours for now. I will correct myself if I'm wrong. So let's say it's 200 hours, only 50 of those hours could be group or children or adolescent hours. So 150 actually has to be individual adult therapy, if that makes sense. So yeah, so I applied to hundreds of places and just applied to anywhere and everywhere, and just was looking for any type of CBT service. So what I did was I googled CBT services, found their emails and just emailed them, and I put a template of my email here, and just to show you what it's like, because I think emails are something that you can very easily overthink, but because you're trying to find a placement and you're emailing so many services, do not group email them individually, but you can copy and paste the same email, if that makes sense. So don't add everyone into two and then just send the email. Actually go ahead and make a new email, just copy and paste the first email template almost, and adjust it to whoever you're talking to, if that makes sense. So another thing is that when you're doing a self-funded course, you have to actually be open to placements actually being voluntary or honorary. So honorary just means voluntary, and you need to be open to, because they're doing you a favour as well as you doing them a favour, if that makes sense. You're helping them with their waiting lists, and their waiting lists are going down. But you have to also remember that your self-funded course is dependent on you having a placement. So you just have to be open to that being voluntary. And at the start, it's going to be 3 hours a week. So if you need a job, you can also work, because you're doing, let's say you're doing part-time, you're doing university one day, you're doing placement for 3 hours in the week, and then the rest of the time you can work. Obviously you might sometimes have to increase your hours at placement, and that's something that I wouldn't go straight into doing. So my hours only increased the summer after I had started. So after my first year, during the summer, I just increased my hours at placement, and then continued that during my second year. And that's something that you'll just adjust for. But I think you have to just be open to it being on a voluntary basis. And you're more likely to get placements that way too. If you get a placement in a private sector, you will have to, some may offer supervision, but in most cases they might actually say, okay, these are placement hours, and you might not get supervision. So then supervision is something that you would have to look for separately. That's why I think sometimes looking for NHS placements is better, because although yes, you might have to do a voluntary or a honorary placement, is that you're actually still getting supervision, and you're getting experience, and you're still learning, or you're getting something out of it. So you're getting supervision and you're learning, whereas within private hospitals you might not get that, if that makes sense. You might get it if you're lucky. In my experience, that wasn't an option. So I would just look into that, and that's just something to be mindful about. Why it's important to be mindful of that is that supervision and having supervision is part of the minimum training standards, and is actually a minimum requirement of being on the course. So it's, or a compulsory requirement of being on the course, because you need to be supervised for your clinical practice. So another point to mention is that when you're applying to some courses, is that they might actually require you to have a placement beforehand. So if you're thinking about applying, I would already start looking for placements, and obviously you will have a conditional placement depending on you getting onto the course, but I know that some places require you to have a placement. Also, if you're already working in a mental health area or field, whether that's with a charity, with an organisation, or like something like the NHS, is that I would look for placements within your trust, because if people already know you, they're more likely to give you those opportunities, if that makes sense. Yeah, so some places will require you to have a placement already in place beforehand. Some places might be open to you having one after you've actually got a place. And that some courses are okay with, they're open to, and some courses might require you to evidence that you're looking for a placement, or just evidence that you might get a placement, if that makes sense. So that's the end of the video. Thank you for making it this far and watching the whole video, and hopefully you found it helpful and it helps you in finding a career in psychology.